Hello VC, welcome to another edition of Pete's CD Vinyl World. Today I want to do a video that I've been planning for a while, worst to best Kiss albums. And I'm going to do this video in two parts, simply because Kiss has so many studio albums that I like. I'm a huge Kiss fan, that it's real tough for me to rank all of them. Once you get past a certain point, it's really tough. So I'm dividing it up into two eras, 74 to 82, which is the original makeup era, and then 83, lick it up to present. So this is the first part. I want to do this video today because my kids are going to be home from school for the next 2 weeks from all this bullshit going on. So anyway, I know Kiss is a band that pretty much is one of the most hated bands in rock and roll, and it seems in the VC community especially, they're pretty highly up there as far as hated bands. I've always been a fan of them. I think musically they're a little misunderstood. I think the image got in front of them first before people really took into consideration the music. So before I get started, obviously this is just going to be strictly their studio albums. I am going to include the 78 solo albums because they are under the Kiss moniker. But when you talk about Kiss, you cannot not talk about Kiss Alive, which probably most people would say is their best album, period. It has probably the better versions of the first three studio albums. So just want to mention that right off the bat. So getting started, my least ranked is the Peter Criss solo album. Now this album was probably a bit of a shock when it came out because it is neither rocking or or hard rock or anything. In fact, it's probably closer to yacht rock than anything else. Part of the reason they did these 78 solo albums is they weren't getting along as a band. They weren't happy with their record deal with Casablanca Records. And they found a loophole in their contract that said if they did solo albums, it could count towards studio album obligations to their contract. So they just all decided to do them. Peter was not the most prolific writer in Criss. He had co-written a couple songs, Beth and Baby Driver. He had sung a lot of songs, at least one or two on each album. He did have a hand in writing a lot of them, but knowing how Kiss are, he probably put his name on a lot of them. So the first song, I'm gonna Love You, is okay. Second song, You Matter to Me, is probably the best song on the album. Definitely has that disco feel to it, which if Kiss fans heard this back in the day, I'm surprised that they were so shocked when Dynasty came out, because the producer on here, Vinnie Poncia, was the guy who produced Dynasty. As years go by, I don't think this is such a bad album when you take it out of context. Obviously, if you heard this in 78, you were like, what kind of piece of shit is this? I mean, besides that, Peter Criss had broken his arm in a car accident, so I only think he plays on You Matter to Me, which is pretty good, the drums on there. But, you would have thought he would have did like a hard rocking, Strange Ways, Black Diamond, those type of songs. It was not what... And even that rocking, harsh Peter Criss voice you hear on a lot of those songs isn't present on here. But like I say, it's not as bad as I would have said back in the 80s or 90s. If you listen to it now, I'm just like, okay, it's all right. Okay. Moving on. Again, another solo album here. Here's the Gene album. And this one's surprising in a lot of ways, too, because Gene was all about the having the guest stars on here. He had so many guest players on here, from Joe Perry to Rick Nielsen. He even wanted to get all four Beatles on here, separately. Cher is on here. He was dating Cher at the time. She does some background vocals, I believe, in Living in Sin. The first song, Radioactive, would have been a great song for Kiss. Probably the best song on here. There's some really good songs on here. See You Tonight, True Confessions, Tunnel of Love, Living in Sin, Man of a Thousand Faces. It's just sort of the lighter side of Gene. Again, in many ways, like Peter, if this album had been the darker, Gene you had heard in some of the songs, God of Thunder, Almost Human, that type of thing, it was probably surprising to a lot of fans because he was known as the Demon, but, here's his Beatlesque solo album. Again, not a bad album. I really don't think Kiss has ever released a really bad album, except maybe some that I talk about in the second half of this video, or the second part of this video, but again, good, okay album. Next up is the album for years I probably would have said was Kiss's worst studio album, and that's Kiss On Mast. This album came out after Dynasty, which sort of shocked the fans and is considered their disco album, even though there's only 2 songs on there that have any kind of disco sound to them at all. This album is also known as trying to be like bubblegum or power pop, and there's a little bit on there, but this album is just a band that just completely got their balls cut off, it sounds like. There's no sort of band unity on this. In fact, this album, I would say, is a collection of 3 groups of solo album songs. So you have Gene songs, Paul songs, and Ace songs, and at this point, I really don't think, besides background vocals, they were playing on each other's songs. So you have 3 Ace songs, Torpedo Girl, Talk to Me, and Two Sides of the Coin, which are just okay. Not that great. Paul's songs were Is That You is actually a cover, even though it wasn't known at the time. I forgot the name. Gerald McMahon is the guy who wrote it. I don't know if he was in a band when he recorded it or he recorded it as a solo track, but that's a pretty good song. Shandy was the semi-hit. This album was big in Australia and Europe, hence why they only toured there. It's kind of odd that they didn't do any promotion for this in the U.S. Peter Criss is on the cover. He did not play on this at all. In fact, on Dynasty, he only played on one track also, Dirty Living, which he sang on. So this was played, all the drums on here were played by Anton Fig. By the time they did the tour for this, they had gotten Eric Carr as the Fox. But it's weird, even when they did promotion for this album in the U.S., by that time they weren't even mentioning the album. They were just sort of introducing Eric Carr, which leads me to believe that they almost wanted this album to sort of fade into oblivion and, have a big return maybe a couple years later, almost like setting themselves up for that. Also, the record company was in sort of disarray at the time. Neil Bogart and a couple of the other top guys from Casablanca were leaving. Polygram had bought Casablanca. Kiss was entering their rock bottom stage in the U.S. They were considered a kiddie band at this point. So, in addition to the confusing title, Unmasked, I mean, what did that really mean? It's funny because recently on one of the Kiss groups on Facebook, they put the original artwork for this album on display. And originally it had said Unmasked with a question mark, which sort of makes more sense when you think about it now. Again, this is one of those albums back in the 80s I would have been like, this is their worst album, hands down. Now when I listen to it, there's quite a few songs I like on it, but I can imagine at the time what you thought of this. The fans that were 13, 14 years old in 1977 were now 16, 17, and they were listening to Judas Priest, Iron Maiden, Motorhead. And by the time this album came out, I don't know if there had been a new crop of Kiss kids for them to be fans of. So that's sort of where this stands. I'm sorry if I'm going on and on about each of these albums, but Anyway, my next pick might surprise a lot of people because this is a very loved album. I'm going to pick Dress to Kill here. Again, top to bottom, this is a pretty good album if you listen to it. But the songs on here that are alive, I prefer the alive versions. Then again, there's a lot of songs on here that aren't on alive. Room Service, Two Timer, Ladies in Waiting, Love Her All I Can, Anything for My Baby, and Getaway. So those songs are all good, but none of them are great. This album, the production is great. It was produced by Neil Bogart, the president of Casablanca. Real clean, crisp sound. Probably the best sounding out of the original three. But it's just not an album I grab so much. Again, these are just my favorites, my opinion. Do I think this album is maybe better than some of the ones I rate higher than this? Yeah, but when I go to grab an album, this is not one of them I grab because I would just rather grab Kiss Alive, you know. Next up was their 1981 concept album, The Eldar. Again, this album was one of the worst moves in rock and roll history for a band that had come off On Mast, which just barely went gold in the U.S. Now they come out with a concept album. The record company was in disarray. The band, Ace really had no interest in this, even though he plays great on it where he does play. They got Bob Ezrin to produce this again, who had produced Destroyer. Just came off of The Wall from Pink Floyd. I guess in their mind they had thought this was a great idea to do this at this point. It seems from what I've read, they were looking for critics to finally give the band some credit. You know, and they were all in on it. If you read, there was a book written just about this album, and you know the band was all gung ho about this. It seems like Bob Ezrin really talked him into doing this. The basic story of it was written by Gene, and so I would say this is predominantly more of a Gene album as far as songs that flesh out the story. But at the same time, there are a couple rockers on here. You know, The Oath on here is pretty much the heaviest thing Kiss had ever done at that point. It's downright heavy metal. The song I, too, was a good anthem that could have been a big hit. You know, it's sort of think Shout It Out Loud combined with Rock and Roll All Night. You know, there's this famous story that Paul Stanley tells about this album when they were so excited to play this for the record company, and they were sitting in a room full of executives. And then after they played the album, they were sitting there with this dumbfounded look on their face. And Paul was like, "What? Isn't this great?" You know? But at that point, I don't understand why they went ahead and released World Without Heroes as the first single. You know, why not just do a Hail Mary and release I? You know, and it's funny because as a 7-year-old when this album came out, you know, I was a Kiss fan at that point. I had Destroyer on cassette, which my cousin had given me. I wasn't, you know, up to the times as far as reading about On Mast, what they were doing. I just, you know, liked Kiss. I remember seeing them on Kids Are People too when they introduced Eric Carr on drums. But I wasn't following their music. I was only 5 or 6 during this period. I was 7 when this came out. They appeared on Solid Gold and played I never knew that was part of a weird concept album. It just sounded like another Kiss song to me. So I don't understand why they didn't release that as a single. It could have been a much bigger song. Even with it, they had another cover here instead of this. This is also Eric Carr's first studio album. Sound is not as big and bombastic as Creatures of the Night, which we'll later discuss, but still a pretty good drum sound. He does perform pretty well. He doesn't play on I. That's actually Alan Schwartzberg on drums on that one. Next up, I'm going to go with the debut. You know, this pretty much has top to bottom classics. Strutter, Nothing to Lose, Firehouse, Cold Gin, Deuce, 100,000 Years, Black Diamond. Those are all the songs that are alive. There's a couple others. Love's Theme from Kiss, Let Me Know, and Kiss in Time, which they added later on. You know, this is definitely an album that when you listen to it now, you're like, wow, this is a good album. But at the time, you could have been like, you know, it's not very heavy. It's not very ballsy. It doesn't sound like what they sound like live. You know, which is all true. Which is, again, why I'm ranking it below some of the other ones. Because, you know, if I want to listen to songs on this, again, I'm just going to grab Kiss Alive. But, you know, as you listen to this album as a whole now, it is a great album. And it's one of them now. I think people for years and years would rank the second three set of albums, Destroyer, Rock and Roll Over, Love Gun, higher than the first three. Now most people rate the first three higher. I'm sort of mixed in the middle about those, but hey, that's just my opinion. Next up, I'm going to go with the Paul Stanley solo album from '78. I don't think it was any surprise that Paul's album was so good. He was pretty much the driving force from Kiss. It surprises me that there wasn't, at least one of these songs wasn't a bigger hit on this album. Especially Wouldn't You Like to Know Me or Love in Chains. They released Hold Me, Touch Me as a single. Kind of schmaltzy throwaway song. But this is definitely one of the more rockin' albums they even put up until this point, you know. Bob Kulick, Carmine Appice even plays drums on some songs here. Has a pretty big, almost Zeppelin-esque sound to it. Tonight You Belong to Me, I think, is one of Paul's best songs he ever wrote. Starts off with this slow intro that builds up into this really big, bombastic song. You know what's really a shame is if you took songs from Paul, Ace's, and Gene's album and throw in one from Peter. I mean, you put that out as the '78 Kiss album. It could have been one of their best albums of all time. It's really a shame that they put out these solo albums instead of a studio album combining these songs. It would have been a really great album. Again, you know, there wasn't much talked about these albums at the time except the hype of just the band releasing the albums. They didn't do any... There's one appearance I saw from Paul doing a local TV appearance. Other than that, they didn't play any of these songs on TV. There was no videos made. So the songs themselves sort of got buried in the hype of the whole thing. They shipped 1 million copies of all of these, so they shipped platinum. They really sold gold, so about 500,000 went back. So you find a lot of these albums even sealed to this day with the posters, inserts, and everything. You know, for the vinyl guys out there, it's harder to find the 83 through 85 pressings than the original 78 pressings, complete with all the inserts and everything. So it's a shame how they handle these, really. They should have almost done a staggered thing where they released maybe one every 2 weeks or one every week and did more publicity for each one. The band themselves, I believe from what I've read, did one record store signing, or maybe Paul did a couple. I don't think they did any as a band. They could have handled the whole thing differently. I think part of it was just the record company trying to blow up the band as this huge thing, so they're going to ship 1 million copies out there, and soon they found their ways to the cutout bins. Next up, I'm going with the Ace album. Pretty much considered, you know, I have to say, I would say these two are tied for me. I'm only going to give Ace the nod because I think there's a couple songs on Paul's album that are just okay for me, whereas this album, pretty much start to finish, is just killer. Eddie Kramer produced this. Ace wrote all the songs, had some help on some. New York Groove as a cover. I forgot the name of the band. I think it's called Hello. And the song was written by Russ Ballard. But, you know, again, big bombastic sound. A lot of guitar tracks on here. You know, you can tell Ace really worked on this album a lot. You know, a lot of songs have acoustic electric guitars on them. The solos are great. Anton Fig plays on this, who he got to later play on Dynasty and On Mast. Almost considered, he was supposedly he was a Kiss member for one day. The story goes that they asked him to join, he accepted. Then Gene and Paul discussed it, and they knew he would have been sort of an ace ally, so they didn't want him at that point, which was okay with him because he had another band called Spider, which was managed by Bill Aucoin, I believe, as well. Anyway, Rip It Out on here, the opening track, one of the most killer Kiss songs, period, by anybody. Speeding Back to My Baby. Even if you're not a Kiss album, if you heard this album, I mean, this is one of the most rocking albums of the 70s, I think, period. Yeah. Next up, I'm going to go with their next studio album after the solo albums, Dynasty. This album obviously got a lot of flack for the disco song, I Was Made for Loving You, which, still is a good song. The album got known as sort of their disco album, but the only other disco I detect on here really is Dirty Living. In fact, I didn't mention it on Mast that there's 2 Paul songs on here, What Makes the World Go Round and Easy As It Seems, that are way more disco than I Was Made for Loving You. Those songs weren't hits, so people don't really remember them. But, at least they didn't do a whole disco album, which would have been sort of a move that I could see Kiss doing at that time, just to delve into it. Then again, the album itself is sort of disjointed. There's not that Kiss sound, even on the rock songs. There's 3 Ace songs on here. 2000 Man, which is a Rolling Stones cover. Hard Times and Save Your Love, which both kick ass. They really do. Probably 2 of the better songs on the album. Sure Knows Something, another Kiss classic. I don't know why that song was not pushed as a single after I Was Made for Loving You was a hit. Wouldn't say it has a disco feel. It has sort of a light verses, disco, not disco-y, yacht rocky verses, goes into a really hard chorus. Gene only has 2 songs on this album, Charisma and X-Ray Eyes, which are just, to me, okay. I like Charisma. A lot of people love Charisma. In fact, there's a video from a TV show in Mexico from 1981, the Eldar era, and they lip sync Charisma because Charisma was supposedly a big hit down there. They love that song down there. And Magic Touch is a great song. Yeah. So, it's not the most accessible album besides I Was Made for Loving You. I don't really know why a lot of the fans turned away from this album, unless they heard I Was Made for Loving You and just didn't buy the album. But the album was a pretty big hit. It sold 2 million copies. It was a top 10 hit album. But then again, at that point the fans were fed up and just had moved on to Maiden and Priest and bands like that. And the lack of hit singles on Mast sort of caused this whole direction to downturn. But it's unfortunate because when you listen to Dynasty today, this is really a well-crafted, really good studio album. You could even say it may be their most well-produced studio album besides Destroyer at this point. Coming in at number 5. Got Rock and Roll Over Here. Some people put this in their top 2 or 3 studio albums of all time. I love Rock and Roll Over Here. It was produced by Eddie Kramer. First one he produced. I Want You, Take Me, Calling Dr. Love, Ladies Room, Baby Driver, good rocker, sung by Peter Criss. Love 'Em and Leave 'Em, it's okay. Mr. Speed, one of the most requested songs that Kiss played live. People love Mr. Speed. I've heard top 10 lists of Kiss songs, and Mr. Speed is always in there. I just think it's okay. I think it's an okay album track. I've never been one to think it's like one of their greatest songs ever. Hard Luck Woman on here is really great, sung by Peter, written by Paul. Surprised it wasn't a bigger hit, actually. Making Love, good rocker. One of their greatest album covers. The sound of this is real ballsy, real balls to the wall. You know, after they released the big produced Destroyer album, this was sort of their back to basics rock album. Production on here, though, kills the first three, I think, you know. Next up is Hotter Than Hell. Probably one of the darker Kiss albums. You know, after the light sort of production of the first album, they were going for a more heavier sound on here, which they have, but it also sounds like this. You remember back in the day when you would dub a cassette of an album, and it sort of just had the dynamics cut off? That's what this album sounds like, even on vinyl. And that's another thing I forgot to mention. I'm just going to show all CDs here, obviously. I didn't want to whip out. I don't have all of these on vinyl. I have a lot of them on vinyl, but I just thought it'd be easier to show the CDs. But yeah, I do have this on vinyl. I have a couple copies on vinyl of this. Supposedly the 2014 sounds the best, so I plan on picking that up soon. But it just, like I said, it just sounds like it was recorded in a tin can. But some of the killer songs on here: Got to Choose, Parasite, Going Blind, Hotter Than Hell, Let Me Go Rock and Roll, All the Way, Watching You, Mainline, Coming Home, and Strange Ways. Strange Ways is probably my favorite Kiss song that was never played live. I think Ace does. In fact, Ace did play it last time I saw him. I don't even think Kiss played it on any of their cruises where they add in rare songs. So that song is just killer. But, you know, as the 70s wore on, this album was sort of forgotten. They on and off had played Let Me Go Rock and Roll into 76, 77. I think on the Dynasty tour they dropped. By the time they got to the Dynasty tour, they were playing one song from each solo album. You know, a few shows into it, they dropped Tossin' and Turnin' from Peter Criss's album and Radioactive from Gene's. So they added in Let Me Go Rock and Roll. But, you know, even when they went on the On Mast tour, they really weren't playing anything from this album. So during the 70s, this was sort of like their forgotten album out of the first six. As the 80s came on, this became a real fan favorite. And now most fans will put this in their top 5. So for me, it's number 4 out of this era. But I'd still probably put it top 5 or 6 overall. Yeah. Next up is an album that a lot of people rank below Hotter Than Hell and Rock and Roll Over. But I really love this album a lot. Again, produced by Eddie Kramer. Not as hot sounding as Rock and Roll Over, but again, to me, this is, if someone wants to ask what does Kiss sound like, I'd probably play this album and maybe the live tracks from Alive 2. To me, that's Kiss. When someone says, what do they sound like? Again, great songs on here. I Stole Your Love, Christine 16, Got Love for Sale. Shock Me, which is Ace's first vocal. Tomorrow and Tonight, it's okay. An attempt at a big anthem there. Love Gun, great song, great solo. Hooligan, rocker sung by Peter Criss. Almost Human is a slow, demonic sounding song from Gene. Plaster Caster. Not really a song that was well known until they started playing it on their Unplugged tour, and it ended up on the Unplugged album. It's probably more known from that than from this album because it was never played live at this era. Then She Kissed Me is a cover of Then He Kissed Me. It's okay. Wish they had put something else on here, to be honest with you. It would have made probably a more solid album top to bottom. But I Stole Your Love is one of my probably top 5 Kiss songs of all time. So we're down to the top 2. So I'm going to have to put this at number 2 here just because during this era I probably can't rank an album without the original band as number 1. So I'm going to go with Creatures of the Night at number 2 here. You know, after the disappointment of On Mast and the Eldar, Kiss were at rock bottom here. So they came back with, without a doubt, their heaviest album they had ever put out. In fact, some of these songs are downright heavy metal. Creatures of the Night, Keep Me Coming, Danger, Killer, War Machine. Those are just balls to the wall metal. You know, this is the heaviest album they had put out at this point. And it's kind of ironic that they took the makeup off after this album, because this is the album where the music was as heavy as the image, dark and as heavy as the image. You know, when you think about albums like Rock and Roll Over, Love Gun, yeah, they're heavy and hard for the time, but their image was so demonic and evil at the time. But the music was hard rock slash power pop. You know, this was their first like metal album. In fact, I would put this up. This is one of the best metal albums of the 80s period. Balls to the wall metal. When you're talking, you know, strictly like Priest, Baden, Dio. I would put this in there as a top 10 balls to the wall metal album of the 80s. You know, most Kiss fans put this in their top 5. I definitely have it in my top 5. Yep, there you go. So number 1's no surprise here, Destroyer. This was my first Kiss album. My cousin gave me a copy of this on cassette in 1979. I was 5 years old. I was at that time listening to rock radio with them. My cousins, we would drive around in the car. My aunt would drive us around if we were doing sleepovers. And even in 79, they were still playing Detroit Rock City on rock radio, along with My Sharona, Don't Let Me Down. So those were my favorite songs of the era. It's kind of funny because I knew the song I Was Made for Loving You, but it wasn't until years later that I realized that was Kiss also. Because at the time, the Kiss songs I knew were Detroit Rock City and Rock and Roll All Night. Maybe another. I'm trying to think if there was another one I knew. You know, I was only 5 at the time in 79. So, you know, this album I listened to so many times. I had a little cassette player. I used to listen to this over and over and over and over. And this is probably their best produced album ever. It's, when you see the Kiss production in the stage show, this is the album that matches that as far as the over-the-top production.